This is the heart of the Cherokee Nation today, a land of resilience, of sovereignty reborn. But this land, now a symbol of survival, was once a destination of exile. Its story was written not in treaties of friendship, but in the footsteps of a people driven from their homes on a journey of unimaginable sorrow. Long time we travel on way to new land. People feel bad when they leave old nation. Women's cry and make sad wails. Children cry and many men cry, but they say nothing and just put heads down and keep on go towards west. Many days pass and people die very much. In the early 19th century, the United States embarked on a policy that would forever stain its history: Indian removal. It was a policy that targeted 5 great southern nations: the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole. This is the story of a tragic and profound paradox. At the very moment these nations were making extraordinary strides to adapt, to embrace the American model of civilization as a means of survival, the United States government decided they had to be erased from the map of the American South. They were not removed because they were seen as savages, incapable of progress. They were removed because their progress had made their land too valuable to be left in their hands. This is the story of how a benevolent policy of assimilation became a brutal instrument of ethnic cleansing, and how from the ashes of that tragedy, 5 nations would endure. In the decades following the American Revolution, the young United States looked to its frontiers with a mixture of ambition and anxiety. Westward lay millions of acres of fertile land, home to indigenous nations for millennia. The official policy of the new republic, articulated by figures like George Washington and his Secretary of War Henry Knox, was not of conquest but of civilization. The federal government aimed to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream society, encouraging them to abandon their traditional ways in favor of farming, Christianity, and private property. It was a paternalistic vision born of the belief that if Native Americans did not adopt European American culture, they would simply become extinct. In the American Southeast, 5 nations responded to this policy with remarkable adaptation. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole became known to white Americans as the 5 civilized tribes. The term itself was a reflection of American values. They were deemed civilized because they had adopted attributes of Anglo-American culture, from constitutional governments to market economies. But these were not fledgling societies. They were the descendants of the great Mississippian mound-building cultures, which had created sophisticated political and religious centers across the Southeast centuries before European contact. By the early 1800s, their societies were complex and deeply rooted in their ancestral lands. The Choctaw and Chickasaw, in what is now Mississippi and Alabama, were renowned agriculturalists. For generations, they had cultivated the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, in communal fields, producing surpluses they traded with other tribes. As American influence grew, they adapted, establishing family farmsteads, raising livestock, and cultivating cotton for the market. Their political structures, once decentralized around individual villages, were evolving into more centralized nations, with leaders who could negotiate on behalf of the entire tribe. The Muskogee or Creek were not a single tribe, but a powerful confederacy of autonomous towns that controlled vast territories in Georgia and Alabama. Their society was traditionally matrilineal, with identity and property passed down through the mother's clan, a system that gave women significant authority. Faced with American pressure, the Creek Confederacy also began to centralize, adopting a written constitution and a national council modeled on the U.S. government. Further south, in the swamps and highlands of Florida, the Seminoles forged a unique identity. They were a diverse community, formed from Creek and other Muskogean-speaking peoples who had migrated south, joined by other tribes and formerly enslaved Africans seeking refuge. Their very name, likely derived from the Spanish word cimarron for runaway or wild one, spoke to their fierce independence and spirit of resistance. For all 5 nations, this process of assimilation was a calculated strategy for survival. They believed that by proving they could be prosperous, Christian, and civilized neighbors, they could secure the right to remain on their ancestral lands. It was a tragically flawed assumption. Their success did not inspire respect. It inspired jealousy and greed. The very act of cultivating their lands, building farms, and establishing towns only made those lands more desirable to the waves of white settlers pushing relentlessly west. Nowhere was this transformation more extraordinary than in the Cherokee Nation. In the span of a single generation, the Cherokee underwent a renaissance that positioned them as one of the most literate and politically sophisticated societies in the world. The catalyst was a man named Sequoyah, a blacksmith and silversmith who could neither read nor write in any language. Sequoyah was captivated by the talking leaves of the white man, the power of written communication. For over a decade, he painstakingly worked to create a system of writing for the Cherokee language. After abandoning an attempt to create a character for every word, he developed a syllabary, a set of 85 symbols representing each syllable of spoken Cherokee. The invention was a work of pure genius. In 1821, Sequoyah and his young daughter Ioka demonstrated the syllabary to skeptical Cherokee leaders. The effect was electric. The system was so logical that a fluent speaker could learn to read and write in a matter of weeks. Within a few years, the Cherokee Nation had achieved a literacy rate higher than that of the surrounding white population. This newfound literacy fueled a political and cultural awakening. In 1828, the nation launched the Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper, published bilingually at their capital of New Echota, Georgia. It was a voice for the Cherokee people, a tool to combat the stereotypes that portrayed them as rebellious Indians and a means of defending their rights on the national stage. The year before, in 1827, the Cherokee took their most defiant step. On July 4th, deliberately choosing the anniversary of American independence, Cherokee delegates convened to draft a written constitution. Modeled directly on the U.S. Constitution, it established a government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Crucially, its first article laid claim to their ancestral lands in perpetuity, declaring them the common property of the nation. It was a bold declaration of sovereignty, a direct challenge to the state of Georgia, which claimed jurisdiction over their territory. The Cherokee were no longer just a tribe, they were a republic. But even as the Cherokee Nation was building a modern state, a powerful economic force was gathering on its borders, a force that would render all their achievements meaningless. That force was cotton. In 1793, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin revolutionized the Southern economy. The machine, which quickly separated cotton fibers from their seeds, made the cultivation of short-stopple cotton immensely profitable. Simultaneously, the Industrial Revolution was taking hold in the textile mills of Great Britain and New England, creating an insatiable global hunger for raw cotton. The American South, with its rich soil and enslaved labor force, was perfectly positioned to feed this demand. The region was transformed into a cotton kingdom, a vast agricultural empire dedicated to producing white gold. Cotton became the backbone of the American economy. On the eve of the Civil War, it accounted for over 60% of the value of all U.S. exports. The United States supplied 77% of the cotton consumed in Britain and over 90% of that used in France and Russia. As South Carolina Senator James Henry Hamden famously declared, "Cotton is king." This kingdom, however, required 2 things to grow: more land and more enslaved people. The most fertile, untapped lands in the Deep South, the future heart of the Cotton Belt, were the ancestral homelands of the 5 tribes. The pressure to open this territory to white settlement became immense. The removal of its native inhabitants was not merely a matter of prejudice or political convenience, it was an economic imperative. The United States needed to acquire these 25 million acres to fuel its most powerful industry and expand the institution of slavery. The fate of the 5 tribes was now inextricably linked to the gears of a global economic machine. The economic demand for Indian land found its perfect political champion in one of the most formidable figures in American history, Andrew Jackson. To his admirers, he was a hero of the common man, a defender of the Union. To the native peoples of the Southeast, he was Sharp Knife, a relentless and ruthless adversary. Jackson's career was forged in conflict with Native Americans. As a general, he had waged brutal campaigns against the Creek and the Seminole, forcing them to cede millions of acres of land. He personally helped negotiate 9 of the 11 major treaties that began the process of dispossession. He held a deep-seated conviction that Indians and whites could not live together as equals. In his view, the tribes faced a stark choice: either assimilate and submit to state laws or move west of the Mississippi.
When he became president in 1829, he brought this conviction to the White House. He sought to renew a policy of political and military action to remove all native tribes from the existing states. Jackson and his supporters framed this policy not as a conquest, but as an act of paternalistic mercy. In his annual message to Congress in December 1830, he presented removal as a humane policy that would save the Indians from certain annihilation. Humanity has often wept over the fate of the Aborigines of this country. To follow to the tomb the last of his race and to tread on the graves of extinct nations excites melancholy reflections. But true philanthropy reconciles the mind to these vicissitudes as it does to the extinction of one generation to make room for another. The waves of population and civilization are rolling to the westward, and we now propose to acquire the countries occupied by the red men of the South and West by a fair exchange and, at the expense of the United States, to send them to land where their existence may be prolonged and perhaps made perpetual. It was a powerful and deceptive narrative. This language of benevolence masked the policy's true purpose. In the same message, Jackson laid bare the real motivations. Removal would incalculably strengthen the southwestern frontier and enable states like Alabama and Mississippi to advance rapidly in population, wealth, and power. It was a policy driven by greed, justified by a perverse form of paternalism that equated ethnic cleansing with salvation. In 1830, just a year into his presidency, Jackson pushed his signature legislation through Congress, the Indian Removal Act. The law itself did not explicitly order the forced removal of any tribe. Instead, it authorized the president to negotiate treaties, granting tribes land west of the Mississippi River in exchange for their ancestral homelands in the east. It promised financial and material assistance for the journey and guaranteed the tribes protection in their new homes forever. But the bill was fiercely contested. The nation was deeply divided. In the Senate and the House, the debate raged for months, exposing the moral schism at the heart of American expansion. Supporters, primarily from the South and West, argued for states' rights, particularly Georgia's right to claim Cherokee land. They painted a picture of inevitable progress, of a dense and civilized population replacing a few savage hunters. The opposition was led by religious groups, humanitarians, and politicians like Senator Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey. In a powerful speech that lasted 3 days, Frelinghuysen appealed to the nation's conscience, accusing the government of violating sacred treaties and the laws of God. "We have crowded the tribes upon a few miserable acres on our southern frontier. It is all that is left to them of their once boundless forests, and still, like the horseleech, our insatiated cupidity cries, 'Give, give.' Do the obligations of justice change with the color of the skins? Is it one of the prerogatives of the white man that he may disregard the dictates of moral principles when an Indian shall be concerned? No, Mr. President." Despite such impassioned pleas, the Indian Removal Act passed. The vote in the House was agonizingly close, 101 to 97. On May 28, 1830, President Jackson signed it into law. The machinery of removal was now in place. With the act in hand, Jackson and his agents were free to persuade, bribe, and threaten tribal leaders into signing away their homelands. The Cherokee Nation refused to be intimidated. Having built a government on the American model, they now sought to use the American legal system to defend their sovereignty. Their fight would lead to a constitutional showdown that pitted the president against the Supreme Court and tested the very limits of the rule of law. The crisis was precipitated by the state of Georgia, which, emboldened by Jackson's support, passed a series of laws in 1828 to annex Cherokee territory, abolish their government, and nullify their laws. The Georgia legislature declared that no Cherokee could testify in court against a white man, creating a state of lawlessness where settlers could steal Cherokee land, livestock, and property with impunity. The Cherokee Nation, led by Principal Chief John Ross and represented by former U.S. Attorney General William Wirt, took their case directly to the Supreme Court. In the 1831 case of Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, they asked the court for an injunction to stop Georgia's oppressive laws. The court, led by Chief Justice Marshall, delivered a complex and ultimately disappointing ruling. Marshall wrote that the court lacked jurisdiction because the Cherokee Nation was not a foreign nation in the constitutional sense. Instead, he defined the tribes as domestic dependent nations whose relationship to the United States resembles that of a ward to its guardian. The case was dismissed, a major blow to the Cherokees' legal strategy. But the fight was not over. A new case soon emerged. Georgia had passed a law requiring all white persons living in Cherokee territory to obtain a state license and swear an oath of allegiance to Georgia. The law was designed to drive out white missionaries who were advising the Cherokee in their resistance. One of these missionaries, Samuel Worcester, refused to comply. He and another missionary were arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 4 years of hard labor. Their appeal reached the Supreme Court in 1832 in the landmark case of Worcester versus Georgia. This time, the Marshall Court issued a decisive and stunning victory for the Cherokee. The Chief Justice wrote that the Cherokee Nation was a distinct, independent political community, and that the treaties between the U.S. government and the Cherokee guaranteed their sovereignty. The Cherokee Nation, then, is a distinct, independent political community, in which the laws of Georgia can have no force, and which the citizens of Georgia have no right to enter but with the assent of the Cherokees themselves, or in conformity with treaties and with the acts of Congress. The ruling was unequivocal. Georgia's laws were unconstitutional, and Samuel Worcester was to be freed. The Cherokee had won. They had used the white man's law to affirm their rights. But their victory was in a court of law, not in a court of power. President Andrew Jackson, a fervent supporter of Georgia and the architect of removal, refused to enforce the Supreme Court's decision. He is famously, if perhaps apocryphally, quoted as saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." Whether he spoke those exact words or not, his actions spoke for him. He did nothing. Georgia ignored the ruling and kept Worcester in prison. The moment revealed the stark truth. A Supreme Court decision is only as powerful as the executive who enforces it. For the Cherokee Nation, their legal rights were meaningless without political protection. The highest law in the land had been defied, and the path to forced removal was now clear. With the legal path blocked and the President of the United States openly hostile, the unity of the Cherokee Nation began to fracture under the immense pressure. This internal division would provide the U.S. government with the final, cynical tool it needed to achieve its goal: a treaty, signed not by the legitimate government of the Cherokee people, but by a small, desperate faction that had lost all hope. A minority within the Cherokee Nation, led by prominent figures like Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and the brilliant editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, Elias Boudinot, came to a grim conclusion. Resistance was futile. They believed that the only way to save their people from annihilation was to negotiate the best possible terms for removal. This group became known as the Treaty Party. In December 1835, U.S. officials called a council at New Echota, the Cherokee capital. The legitimate government, led by Principal Chief John Ross, boycotted the meeting, as did the vast majority of the Cherokee people. But the Treaty Party attended. Out of a nation of over 16,000, only about 500 were present. There, this small, unauthorized group signed the Treaty of New Echota. They agreed to cede all remaining Cherokee lands in the southeast in exchange for $5 million and territory in the west. News of the treaty was met with outrage and disbelief throughout the Cherokee Nation. Chief Ross and the National Council immediately declared it a fraud, arguing that the men who signed it had no authority to represent their people. They drafted a protest petition, which was signed by nearly 16,000 Cherokees, virtually the entire nation, and sent to Washington.